is up, guys? Welcome back to the Scotch Gambit, Chapter 1, the Bishop moves. We're going to get into Part 2, Bishop C5. If you saw Part 1, that was Bishop B4. We looked at lines like pushing the pawn, mostly dealing with going back, castling from here. And now black has to think about king's safety, how to get castled, and which way to bring this knight out as we bring our pieces forward. So that was a little bit of Part 1. And now we're going to go on to Bishop to C5. In our last move, we played bishop to C4 instead of taking the pawn in the center. So black is essentially saying, if you're not going to take the pawn, I'm going to defend it. So our major plan is going to be to castle now and try to quickly attack black before he has a chance to castle. So this is the starting position for Chapter 1, Part 2, and black is essentially dealing with the same problem he was dealing with in Part 1. How can he get this knight out and castle safely? If he just brings it out straight away to f6, we can push our pawn to e5 and enter the max Lang attack. Just know we're going to cover this position in the next chapter when we deal with the knight moving out. This video is going to cover two moves. We're mostly going to deal with d6, but black also has this move knight g to e7. Here he safely gets his knight out and he doesn't have to worry about this e5 push because his knight isn't on the f6 square. However, we can counter this move by playing knight to g5. Because black's knight isn't on f6, it's not there to cover the g4 or the h5 squares for the queen to come in, and it also isn't covering h7. There's no kicking this knight because the knight just jumps in and forks black's pieces and the game is over. And there's no castling out of danger because we can play queen to h5, threatening checkmate in 1. Black has to push this pawn, and we take with our knight on f7, and we set up these same patterns that we saw in the first part. If we go back, also note here that knight to e5 does not work because we can trade off our pieces any way we want. And at the end of these trades, we have this nice move, queen h5, picking up this bishop on c5. So none of these moves are going to work. The only thing that black can do in this position is play d5. When we see this move, we're always just going to take it with our pawn. Now remember, black does not have time to castle here because we can just take the knight. And black can't take our pawn because of this tactic, knight takes f7, forking the queen and rook, forcing black to take, and then throwing in this check. If black goes back to g8, things get even worse, so black has to go to e8. We take our piece back, and black is trapped in the middle of the board. This is a game we should be able to win. So when we take this pawn, the only move that black can play here to survive is knight to e5. If he finds this move, we just move our bishop back and play from here. So that was knight g to e7, and the rest of this video is going to be concerned with d6. Now, if we stop for a second and take note of this position, 4 things change when d6 is played. For 1, this bishop is now ready to come out. Number 2, this knight can now come out to f6, and it's protected against e5. Number 3, this knight can now come to e5, and it's protected by the d6 pawn. And number 4, this bishop on c5 is now protected as well. So whenever we see d6, we're going to play the move c3 and enter into the Haxo Gambit. Usually the Haxo Gambit was done a move prior, right here, but we took that time to castle and essentially allow black to choose between playing against the max Lang attack or the Haxo Gambit. So he chooses the Haxo Gambit and we play c3. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the Haxo Gambit Accepted. If they take this pawn, we're always going to take back with our knight and play from here. We can assume that our opponent wants to bring out this black knight somehow. Really quickly, we're just going to rule out a potential move, knight to h6. We can just completely shut this move down by playing bishop g5, attacking the queen. When the queen moves, we can pick up this knight on h6, and when they take back, we play knight d5. You're going to see this theme a lot in the Haxo Gambit of playing bishop g5 followed by knight d5 or vice versa. So we ruled out knight h6, but what about knight g to e7? We can play the same move that we played before the Haxo Gambit and we put our opponent on a tightrope. None of these moves in red will work. Our opponent has to play knight to e5. There's no time to attack the knight because the knight jumps in. There's no time to castle because the queen comes to h5. And now there's no more time to block with e5 because our Haxo Gambit knight has now come out. And we should be able to win after exchanges like this. So now our opponent finds the correct move, he plays knight e5. And now look at the importance of this d6 pawn. This d6 pawn defends this bishop right here. So if we try trading everything off, we don't have this queen h5 resource anymore, checking the king and picking up this bishop because it's defended. So if we go back, we can't respond to this move, knight e5, by trading everything off. What we have to do is introduce another concept in the Haxo Gambit, and that's playing b4. b4 is a resource that you should look for on every single turn in the Haxo Gambit, because there will sometimes be tactics that don't look like they work, but they do. If black takes our bishop, we can take theirs, and we set a nice little trap for them, where if they try to take this pawn back, we just trade queens and play knight to f7, winning the game. Black cannot take this pawn because now we can trade everything off just like before, but instead of checking on queen h5, we check with bishop b3. Black blocks, and now it's soon to be even material, and white is in a slightly more comfortable position. So if black retreats with their bishop, we can just bring our bishop back to e2 so that when our knight gets kicked, it's properly defended. So now let's go back. So we go back to the beginning of the Haxo Gambit, and we just looked at knight g to e7. This is an option. Knight to h6 is a terrible option, but let's look at the main move, knight to f6. So this is the main position in the Haxo Gambit, and we're going to use two main moves, bishop to g5 and knight to d5, to try to break black's pawn structure as he's castling kingside and trying to get king safety. We're also going to add in one more move, b4, to try to attack black's bishop when the moment is right. Notice how when we play d5, that's going to support b4. One more idea is after playing b4, attacking this bishop, is sending our queen either to b3 or, if possible, to h5. Let's look at some attacks now. So the knight comes out to f6, and we play bishop to g5, pinning that knight to the queen. Now if black tries to kick our bishop here with h6, we can just take this knight, and when black takes back with the queen, we'll jump in with d5, attacking this c7 pawn. Black has no choice. He's on the tightrope. He has to go back, and then we throw in this move b4. If black takes with either piece, we can just take it with the knight. The knight was defending that square after all, and we play b3. The knight retreats, and we take here, and we prevent black from castling. If we go back, let's say black takes with the knight first. We take that knight, and when black takes back with the bishop, we can play to a4 this time, checking the king, attacking the bishop. Black has to block, and we pick up that bishop for free. If we go back, so when black goes back, we play b4. The bishop has to go back. We can play a4, starting to expand on the queen side. We can think about doing things like queen b3, pushing e5, pushing rook e1, rook d1, and set up an attack from there. So if we go back, if black castles at this point, we throw in knight d5. The general plan is going to be taking this knight on f6 with our bishop. Let's say black plays bishop e6. We can take this knight, and they have to take back with the pawn because our knight defends that square. Now we're going to play this sneaky move, queen d2, to try to get our queen into this h6 square. We can combine this with the idea of going knight h4 and knight f5, trying to mate on the g7 square. It's also perfectly fine to let this knight come into the center of the board. We can just play queen h6, and we actually don't mind opening up this file. Because our queen's so close to the king, it's going to help us a lot more than it's going to help black. So now let's go back. Let's say black plays rook e1 here. We can do the same plan, taking on f6. When they take back, we can play queen d2 and look to get our queen on this square. Let's say our opponent plays king g7 to prevent this. We just go back to our original plan of playing b4. The bishop goes back. We play a4, and we start expanding on the queen side. So let's go all the way back. We can also transpose to these types of positions by looking at where this light square bishop goes. If it goes here first, we can block with knight d5, and if black castles, we'll be in the very same position as we were last time. If the bishop instead takes our knight, we're going to take back with the pawn because we get a tempo on this knight here. The best square for this knight is going to be on e5. We're just going to trade off these knights and play this nice move, queen a4. And now there's no way to block this check and castle. Note you can win a quick game here. If black blocks with the queen, we can just play bishop to b5 and win the game pretty quickly. So let's go back. So that was bishop to e6. Let's look at bishop to g4. It's almost like we're ignoring everything that black is doing and just playing bishop to g5 and knight d5. Black can play this scary knight to e5 here, attacking our bishop on c4 and simultaneously attacking the knight on f6. Here I would recommend just calmly going back with bishop e2, but if you're feeling up for it, you can even play b4 right now. Actually, it's the best move in the position. But we go back with bishop e2. If they want to trade everything off, this is winning for white. So they accepted the Haxo Gambit and they played knight f6, and we pinned their knight with bishop g5. We looked at what happens when the pawn comes up, we looked at what happens when they castle, and we looked at what happens when the bishop comes to e6 and g4. If it goes to d7, we can play the, you guessed it, knight d5. And if they castle here, we can take this knight, they'll have to take back with the pawn, and we play our move queen d2, trying to get into this h6 square. Let's say they counter it by playing king to g7. We can play the wonderful b4 once again and play from here. We can also approach the Haxo Gambit from the perspective of what we do when the bishop moves first. So if this light square bishop moves first, let's say it goes to d7, we can just play bishop g5 anyway, trying to bait this reaction knight f6, and now we're back to these same variations we saw before, where we play the knight here and look to take this knight with the bishop, ruining black's pawn structure. If instead of d7, black plays e6, trying to trade off bishops, we can jump in with knight d5 first, preventing that. And now if black plays knight f6, looking to trade off knights, now we can play bishop g5, pinning the knight to the queen. Now finally, let's look at bishop to g4 first. We're going to play bishop to g5, attacking the queen, baiting this move, going back to these same variations where black will usually castle. We take this knight and we play queen d2, not worrying about losing this knight because ideally our queen is going to get into h3 and we want to get our rooks into this open file. Okay, so now we're going to get into the Haxo Gambit decline line, and we're just going to look at the main decline line, which is bishop g4. So if we push this c-pawn and black does not take our pawn, they can immediately play bishop to g4. We are always going to respond to this move by playing queen b3. We immediately get out of the pin, and if black wants to ruin our pawn structure by taking this knight, we're first going to take with check, and black will never be allowed to castle as well. We take back this bishop, and the most dangerous looking move here is knight to e5, attacking our bishop, as well as threatening to take this pawn with check. When black plays knight e5, we just calmly take this pawn on d4, and if black picks up this bishop, we take a bishop of our own, and when black takes back, we can now swoop in with queen b7. The last thing I want to address in the Haxo Gambit declined is why can't black just bring out the knight right now and attack this undefended piece. This just allows us to take on d4, attacking the bishop, basically taking the entire center. When the bishop goes back, we can push d5. If the knight wants to come to the center, we can just trade it off and play knight c3. White should have a slight advantage in this kind of position. Okay guys, thank you for watching part 2 of chapter 1. That was bishop to c5. So in part 1, we covered bishop to b4, and in the next part, we're going to cover bishop to c7. In chapter 2, we're going to cover ideas like the Max Lang attack and what to do when this knight comes to f6.